In our first webinar conducted in October, we focused upon disaster shelters. And at that session, we were privileged to have, as an SME, Denise Everhart of the American Red Cross. Their work is invaluable, courageous, and is beyond praise, particularly when you think about the complexity of managing large-scale disasters, hurricanes, and wildfires. But now we have one that perhaps is even more widespread. And Denise's observations, I think, are very timely. I want to start her presentation by quoting one of our participants, who made some very trenchant comments when Denise was through with her presentation. Quote, "This is a great forum. Denise mentioned that we came into this crisis with a set of ideas. I think as emergency managers have been trying to adopt the big box theory to providing emergency services, which might have worked if all we had was an earthquake or a landslide somewhere. But this current ongoing slow burning nationwide disaster makes it pretty clear that we can't implement that theory. Maybe we need to think about what is working for people coping with COVID-19, how they're assessing and accessing services to get by day. Maybe we adopt more of an Amazon or HelloFresh model to providing emergency services," end quote. And we disavow any endorsements of any particular products or companies. Here's Denise. Well, hello, Denise, and welcome back to our continuing conversation from our October webinar series on disaster shelter. We certainly appreciate your coming back and joining us to answer questions we just didn't have time to get to in that series. Please introduce yourself to the participants here.
I'm Denise Everhart. I'm the Division Disaster Executive for the Pacific Division of the American Red Cross that covers Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, California, and all of the Pacific Islands that are a state, a commonwealth, or a territory.
Does the pre-COVID, quote unquote, big box concept of disaster shelter work anymore?
It does. We've even used it in COVID. We have increased the spacing, and we've learned a lot about hygiene and protecting our clients. But at the end of the day, if one of these hurricanes had hit multiple states, or one of these wildfires had really caught more homes on fire, I know they caught a lot of homes, but if they'd caught more, that emergency sheltering is really the best resource. The other side of the coin is, as tourism comes back, the ability of hotel rooms is going to go down. Traditionally in disaster settings, we haven't been able to find hotel rooms because those who could stay in them would stay in them. They're under some level of evacuation. We don't have the facilities other than these large congregate shelters to shelter people. Now, we're going to lean more towards more spacing and better hygiene, but we've always tried to do that. And you just have to make do with the space that is in front of you.
Just what's your general understanding of the Red Cross's, in particular, liability exposure if, say, in the course of sheltering someone, they become infected, or there are other kind of problems that might imply potential liability?
But the American Red Cross, we do really look at the safest practices and the common practice out there. So in a COVID environment, we strictly followed CDC guidance. Oftentimes, we were sheltering in places where maybe the local government didn't require a mask or something, but we strictly adhered to the letter of CDC guidance. For the first time ever, I found myself putting calls into state public health and saying, hey, will you do a tour of any of our congregate sheltering to make sure we're in alignment? And that wasn't from a liability standpoint. That was from a, tell me what I have to do to make it better and make it safer.
I mean, I think that is consistent with the kind of theory of liability, that if you're doing everything that, represent model practices and having due diligence and being prudent, I mean, that's probably the best defense, against that kind of exposure. Is it, say, for example, a practice or a common practice that people who are sheltering in the context of a disaster leave the shelter or can leave the shelter, come back, say, in the evening or whatever the case might be? Or what do you think is the best practice around that to maintain control for as long every day as you can, or to provide some, kind of escape valves and things of that kind?
Any of those things that people need to do, they are welcome to leave. They register in and out. When we get into large, complex sheltering operations, we'll normally give them a wristband to try and speed things up. Of course, in a COVID environment, we're taking temperatures and asking questions every time they come and go. But part of that is part of trying to maintain the normal for people in our shelters. Leaving a shelter is very common. As a matter of fact, we work closely with our partners to set up transportation routes, make sure people have the ability put into like disaster recovery centers that FEMA run or multi-agency resource centers.
People leave the shelter, you've got them registered. What if they don't come back? What if, for example, they engage in hazardous practices that might result in infectivity or something like that? I mean, you see the kind of host of things when people leave the umbrella of the shelter. Now, notwithstanding, I couldn't agree more with you. We have to have life. We have to preserve, normalcy to the extent we can in a horrible time. But have you had to wrestle with that? I mean, that kind of maybe potential dilemmas?
We always have to wrestle with that. People
Yeah.
are people. And even before a COVID environment, if you look at the campfire in Paradise, we sheltered for 99 days after the campfire. That's a long time for people to be staying in what is essentially a open area dorm at a fairgrounds. And they'd go out and they'd drink, they'd go out and they'd do all sorts of things, right? And we had to have rules.
I'm going to just read you one of the comments that we got that was kind of a prelude to a question. Volunteerism is the backbone of many mass care operations, including sheltering and feeding. Yet many organizations struggle to recruit and sustain sufficient volunteers while seeing the same people volunteer across multiple organizations. How can we reinvigorate the spirit of volunteerism, especially among the younger age group, ensure safety from the unseen hazards like biologicals, and maintain the trust of the public and those who rely on these services in their time of need?
So we knew we were going into a big disaster season and we were worried. And so what we did was we looked at our training and we said, how do we fix it? And we really narrowed our focus. We said, we need seasonal readiness people. We put together a seasonal readiness campaign. We got our training down to under 4 hours, all of it virtual. So you could teach it anywhere across the country and people could take it. We made sure they were interactive classes, but we made sure that if I've got a ton of volunteers or a ton of staff over on the East Coast, they can teach at 9 o'clock at night, their time. And that's still during the day for people on the West Coast. So we worked on that. And then we recruited. We recruited. And we actually saw more volunteerism this past year than we had in previous years.
Have you ever had to relocate a disaster shelter, maybe a big operation, because of, well, any number of factors? I mean, it seems like when you're in wildfire territory, then things change pretty quickly.
Unfortunately, it happens all the time in wildfire country. Not as much in hurricane country because you can kind of see it coming, but we are constantly having to move shelters. Whenever we pick a shelter, especially if it's in a dynamic disaster environment, we've already thought the next 2 down the road. We lean on our government partners, but we've seen in past disasters that transportation is a challenge. Road access is a challenge, access and functional needs. Some of those transit challenges are the biggest challenge.
Setting up a shelter is big enough. Setting up a transportation system seems to me, particularly with all the different needs and challenges, a really daunting job. What have you learned, in I'm sure you're successful outings on that?
Like anything, you've got to look at your toolbox and say, what tools are in our toolbox? Traditionally, It has been public transit. It has been private contractors for paratransit. But in the past, I would say probably since Katrina, there's been a renewed focus on that. And that focus has come from people who are designated either disability integration or access and functional needs. Both terms are used, and they're leads. And they're leads at FEMA, at the state. A lot of counties have them. We have a disability integration function. And those are people who, in planning for a disaster, that is really their focus.
If you consider a disaster population in a shelter, there are going to be myriad conditions and situations. We talked about access functional needs, the elderly, but there could be domestic violence issues. There could be kids in danger of predation, sexual or otherwise. There could be folks with a criminal past, on and on and on. I mean, I don't have to tell you that if you've seen 1,000 people in a shelter, you've seen 1,000 people. So talk to us a little about, what can or can't be done to attempt to manage what is, ultimately a huge challenge for safety and welfare of all concerned, including your volunteers and staff.
It takes a whole community to run a shelter because you're building a whole community. So we put a lot of common things in place to try and mitigate any problems. We have anybody who's a registered sex offender, they self-identify with us. And they're really good about that because they have to register. We work with local security or law enforcement wherever possible. We bring in other partners in sheltering to provide disaster mental health. We have disaster mental health workers too, but we also bring in people to help with casework. We're all aware that there are people who are in peril, whether from domestic abuse or peril from a sexual predator. And we try and do everything we can to keep track of everybody and to make sure that each person, each family has a moment where they can either signal, call, text, something for help if they need it.
Has anything changed in your own thinking since we met last in October? And maybe more important, what do you think's the end game here?
We have learned a lot in our practice of non-congregate sheltering. This was really a new world for us. We would do one-offs and smaller groups for multi-family fires, but we've never done non-congregate sheltering on this kind of a scale. And so we built a lot of systems on the fly. They weren't always pretty. And so right now what we're doing is really trying to take a hard look at what 2020 brought us.
The Center for Homeland Defense, of course, makes a point in our programs to keep a wide-ranging view of how to best prepare and respond to and recover from disaster. I think in many corners, the only conversation that's going on right now is COVID, and yet we have climate change. We have people who want to do us harm. We have cyber attacks. We have, a whole array of things that you're preparing for. And I think that's real important to remain mindful of the fact that typically disasters come in groups, not singular.
I was looking at a PowerPoint where I was talking about 2018, and I was listing out all of our disasters, and I'd written at the bottom, no wonder we're so tired. And we've been on more disasters in 2020, plus a pandemic and all of the other unrest going on. All the trends show us that this is not going to be a cycle that's going to stop. It's just going to keep increasing. And so we're going to really have to work on reimagining in some ways what we do outside of disasters.
You have our undying thanks and praise for the work you do every day. And again, thanks for being part of this series.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate all the work you guys do and the ability to be part of this conversation.